name's Roger Watson from House of Complexity, and tonight I'm really honoured to host my very dear friend and long-time collaborator, Professor Kees Dorst, to be the proceedings for tonight. Kees and I have worked together since 2010, and it's a large body of work that was really life-changing for me as a public servant, as I was back then, a criminologist and a psychologist. And meeting Kees was a life-changing event for me, both professionally and personally. We've worked really closely together, as I say, since 2010. We've written books together, but tonight Kees is going to be speaking about a book that he has coming out very soon, or actually it's out in the Northern Hemisphere. Kees is Professor of Transdisciplinary Innovation at the University of Technology's TD School. He's also the James Way Visiting Professor in Entrepreneurship at Princeton University at the Keller Center. Kees, long time no see. It's always lovely to catch up with you, and I'm really looking forward to tonight. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, well, you're very, very welcome. I heard that we have a bit of a broad audience today. So what I'd really like to do is just give a kind of general overview, introductory talk, which means that I'm going to be talking quite quickly and introducing concepts and models one after the other. There's longer stories to all of these. So please be an active listener and sort of look at things you want to know more of, because we've got plenty of time for questions afterwards. So this is basically just a flyover of some of the key concepts in the book that Steve Sullivan was just holding up. He can do that again, I think. Come on, Steve. Yes. And so I think I'll just launch into this presentation to give you a quick idea about what it is about and which kind of ideas are coming together. I mean, it was kind of a complex book to write because there's kind of 9 models that come together, and I'll be dealing with about 3 or 4 of them in a little bit of depth this time around. So really happy to be here, and I'll start sharing screen and see if technology works for us today. If this works, it works. Okay. So, and really the book is called Deep Change because I think, let's say my own background is in design and in philosophy, and I've slowly moved from studying design and designers to realizing that, okay, actually, a lot of the practices that designers have are really useful in many other fields too, which became transdisciplinarity, which became sort of the things that we managed to start at UTS in that space. But it is really about change. It's not about design per se. Design is a means to an end, and a very important means to an end. But Deep Change for me is kind of the book where it all comes together, where I've sort of brought together the things that I've learned from design and from working with all these other disciplines into a kind of coherent whole. And I'll explain a little bit why, and I'll explain a little bit about the kind of issues and problems that we are facing today and how Deep Change connects to that. Next to the book Deep Change on this slide, you also see the book Reinventing Strategic Innovation, together with Roger and Barbara. We pulled that together, and that's really the practice book. So Deep Change is the thinking book, and Reinventing Strategic Innovation is based on a master's degree program that we could set up at UTS, teaching these things to professionals, including Steve Sullivan, and then realizing that, okay, these are the practices that these professionals actually pick up and pull together as sort of creating a new way of dealing with strategic innovation. So that's why that's the practice book, and Deep Change, the book in the middle, is the more thinking book, which is sort of shows how the ideas are brought together. Both books are full of case studies because my own background, as I said, is in design and in philosophy. And at heart, I'm basically a practitioner. I mean, I'm a philosopher too, so yes, I do read, but my inspiration comes from practice. And so I always need to be close to practice. And let's say the things that Roger and I did together in the Designing Out Crime Center were really based on the projects that we could be doing, our reflection, our theorizing, developing up a whole practice for that. So just to start off, to kick this all off as sort of an entry into this way of thinking, it starts with a big question mark because we're basically not solving our problems anymore. I actually don't have to explain too much about that because you look around in the world and you see organizations, governments, public sector, as well as private organizations just not dealing with the issues that need to be dealt with and failing in that time and time again. So that makes a person wonder and say, well, actually, it's probably the way we do this that's wrong because we need to probably move beyond business as usual. Now, moving beyond business as usual is what we do a lot, and we call that innovation. When something isn't working anymore, you need something new. But I guess in this time, we realize that our normal way of innovating doesn't work anymore either. So we also need to move beyond innovation as usual. And to understand what we should be doing to properly respond to the issues that are coming our way, um, we need to sort of backtrack a little bit and think about, okay, what is the issue here? One of the first things we need to do also is to stop fixing things. I think it's a really important one because politicians promise that they will fix this and fix that, and you can't actually. This new type of problems requires a different response and also leads to a different kind of outcome. But I will explain a little bit better. So the philosopher part of me says that, well, okay, if you look around the world, actually you see that the problems in the world that we're dealing with have become more open, complex, dynamic, and networked than ever before. And so, okay, yeah, what's the issue? Well, an open problem means that there is no boundaries. So you can't really define the problem very well. And there is this fuzzy space. You don't know who the stakeholders are going to be later on as you're trying to resolve this. So organizations are made for identifying a problem, putting a boundary around it, the rest you call context, and this is what you're focusing on, etc. But with open problems, you can't really do that. You can focus a little bit, but it always has to be fluid because you don't know what's going to be involved later on in the process. Complexity is the next one. And of course, in complexity, we talk about complicatedness when you say, well, there's many elements and there's many relationships between these elements. Um, that's what we are used to. That's what engineers are really good at. That's where sort of technocratic thinking is made to deal with complicatedness. But in complexity, there's also relationships between the relationships, interdependencies. And that gives us all kinds of problems because it actually upsets the way we reason very badly. I'll get to that in a minute. Problems have also become dynamic, so they change over time. So you can't say to the rest of the world, okay, if everybody holds their breath for half a year now, we'll solve this problem and then we'll implement the solution. Because by the time that you're trying to do that, the context will have shifted. So what you really need to do is not withdraw from the world with your problem and trying to resolve it, but really be in contact with the changing context all the time. So you're talking about developments rather than projects that are set. And problems have become networked across organizations, which means that probably solutions will also be networked across organizations. So it's not your own problem anymore. You can't really define it. It's also not your own solution anymore. And that's also a wider thing. So, and if you want to cut a very long talk very short, you'd probably say that, okay, if the problems that you're dealing with as an organization, be it a government organization or whatever, more open, complex, dynamic, and networked, you will probably have to become more open, complex, dynamic, and networked yourself. Because successful organizations are good because they're mirroring the environment that they're in. They're mirroring the issues that they're dealing with. So, which is a huge challenge because organizations like to own problems, like to define them well, like to simplify them, like to freeze the world around them so that they can come up with a good solution, and they'd like to own the solution. So this is exactly what organizations are not made for. Yet this is a reality, and we need to deal with the reality. because otherwise you just have to make a lot of assumptions and you run a risk of being completely irrelevant. And I guess complexity is the big bugbear in this whole list, because in real complexity, what gets threatened is causality. Because normally we think in a causal way. Sort of normal kitchen way of thinking is you do this, and then this is the result of that. There's a causal relationship between action and result. But in complexity, you do this, an action, and there's lots of things that start to move and change. That's really difficult. So you can't actually count on causality in the way that you normally did. And that means that you actually have to forget solutions. In a really complex environment, there is no silver bullet, one thing that you can think of and create, and everybody is happy. Now, in a really complex environment, what you need to do is create interventions that move the whole system into a better state, and again, and again, and again. So there's no problem anymore. There's also no solutions anymore. This is really bad news for designers who are used to go from a briefing to a project end with a solution. In these kind of issues, that just doesn't exist. And I'll get to that later in one of the case studies that I want to show you. And it also means that we basically, because causality is slightly out the window, we need to forget problem solving, which is a really hard one because we've literally from a young age been brought up as problem solvers. There is a problem, we need to do something about it, and then it's gone. No, if you can't do that anymore, what can you do to create that progress? What can you do to create a better world? Because you can't give up on these things. On the other hand, problem solving is not the right thing to do. And I'll explain that later. Just as sort of a quick intro into the kind of thinking, I got to this sort of broader issues based on the notion of framing. Framing is the idea that, wait a minute, when we have a problem and the way we define a problem, there's an approach that is embedded in that definition. And if that is a common definition, then probably that definition holds the problem in place. So I want to welcome you to King's Cross in Sydney, where we did a project a long time ago on problems in the entertainment district there, because later in the evening there is violence, and we got approached by the city of Sydney, who said, well, this is alcohol-related violence is the problem. And you go, okay, but that's a really strong framing where you go, okay, we've got violence, we've got alcohol, we say there's a causal relationship between these two things. So if you want to bring down the violence, you do that by bringing down the alcohol. That was the whole idea behind their problem definition. And they'd been working with that problem definition for many years. And they tried all kinds of things to bring down the alcohol, etc., but it hadn't actually impacted the violence. So I think, well, probably that framing is just not right. It may help to a certain degree, a little bit, but there's still a problem that we see. So how can we look at this differently? So we went out there with sort of staff and students, and basically, there are a couple of me then. We basically went out and looked at, okay, what is the situation here? And we quickly realized that if you're looking at King's Cross as a situation, there's 30,000 young people that want to have a good time, and they're really bad at it, and things go wrong. But that doesn't really seem to be related to alcohol that much at all. There's other things at play. But how can we look at this differently? If we move away from this is a crime problem and it's alcohol-related violence, what would be a different way that is productive, that helps this situation forward? One of the frames that came up, that became one of the more dominant ones to work on, was basically saying, well, if this is about 30,000 young people that want to have a good time, and it gets very messy and it goes wrong, what can we do about that? How can we look at this whole situation differently? And then you say, well, actually, this is 30,000 young people. It's more or less the same people that also go to music festivals. And in music festivals, they're normally very nice, and people are nice to each other, and there's a lot of entertainment. There's good things to do, etc., etc. So um, let's look at King's Cross as if it is a music festival. King's Cross is not a music festival, but looking at it through that lens, what can we see that we normally don't see when we see it as alcohol-related violence and a crime problem? So, and then you make a fairly simple comparison in the end, going, okay, what do you do when you organize a music festival? What have we done in King's Cross? So, for instance, I mean, there's 35 different solution directions that came from this simple comparison. But you go to things like, okay, if you go to a if you organize a music festival, you make sure that people can get there and that people can get away when they want. Um, if you look at the situation in King's Cross at that point in time, the peak of young people coming into the area is quite late at night, sort of between 12 and 1 in the morning. There's a lot of people arriving. The last train from King's Cross station left at 1:20. So you think, okay, so people are basically stuck there. Even people that are sort of fed up and want to go home have trouble going home. They can take a taxi, but taxis are quite expensive for young people. And actually, the taxi queue would be hours long. And a lot of the things that went wrong actually were related to that taxi queue environment there. So you think, well, people are basically fed up. So are there other ways to get people away from there? And can we let the trains run longer, etc.? Just to make sure that you do that right. Another thing in a music festival is that you make sure that you've got a couple of headline acts that people need to wait for maybe, but they don't determine the atmosphere. The atmosphere is determined by smaller acts that are happening all the time. And in King's Cross, really there's a couple of really big places that people want to get into, and there was nothing much else to do on the street, really. It's quite a boring environment in a way. I think that's not right. That doesn't give the right atmosphere. Um, I mean, on a very physical level, if you organize a music festival, you make sure that you have all these sort of portable toilets everywhere with clear signage to where you can pee if you need to. In King's Cross, there were actually at that point 3 public toilets for the whole area, one of which was at the police station, so nobody goes there. You go, sort it out. Make sure that you deal with this situation and make it a much better situation for people to be in. In a way, also make it more fun to be out in King's Cross. But most importantly, just deal with it as a public situation. Yes, it's a public space, it's not a music festival, but it's actually almost used in the same way by these people. So let's make sure that they can. And then a lot of the trouble will disappear. So that's what we did, and those were the interventions that were placed. So it's not one big solution, it's many little things, but they come from this other way of looking. And the funny thing with the music festival as a frame is that it really, the moment you see it and the moment you connect that to this situation, you can't unsee it anymore. It's very hard to look at this as a crime problem after you've looked at it as a music festival. And that's what a strong frame does. It kind of captures it captures your imagination, it captures your mind, and it leads to all kind of things that you suddenly can do that otherwise you wouldn't think of. So I think this is something really important that designers can bring, because in these complex situations, they're all stuck. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a problem. You need other ways of looking at this, and probably not one, but many. I mean, this is just an example of one frame, but we had more frames at King's Cross. And we've actually been working in King's Cross for about 10 years since that first project, because continuously you could see how things could be better and other frames were more important in other moments in time or for other target groups, etc. So there's a lot of things that you can do, but you're not talking about a project anymore. You're really talking about a sustained engagement to deal with a very complex situation and to sort out what you can do to better that situation. So it's very far away from problem solving. In a way, it's also slightly away from design being something that goes from briefing to end result. It is a really different way of thinking. Now, to create these new frames, there's a whole process that I won't go through in this talk right now, or you can ask about it later. But it's really sort of stepping back and going, okay, what is the current situation, what is the tension in there, what are the paradoxes, what is the environment in which that tension sits, how can we think deeply about the underlying values that are at play here, and how can we use those values as inspiration to come to new frames. And in the case of King's Cross, what that looks like is, so on the left you've got the old situation, alcohol-related violence, alcohol-related crime, and that way of thinking is a world in itself. It leads to certain actions. Under those actions are methods. There's some principles that are used, and there's values that you try to achieve when you look at it in that way. What we did is move away from that, so going from actions all the way back to value, and then say, well, there's these other values that you also want to achieve, like a vibrancy. People are sort of basically forming their identity through these interactions that they have with one another. It's a really social place. How can we actually, from those values, rethink what should be done in King's Cross? So I guess that's what we do time and time again. The trick here is that problems always come to us on an action level. Something needs to happen. And if we've got a good repertoire of actions, we just use actions from our repertoire and we get on with life. That's really great. Sometimes you're forced to rethink your actions and go for other methods, so go one level deeper. But what I've seen these designers do, and what I think is a strength of this kind of methodology, is to actually go from these actions all the way back to the value level and say, what is this about? And how can we use inspiration maybe from somewhere else to deal with these values in a different way? Create new principles, new methods, and therefore also new actions that you can't think of if you're only stuck on that action and method level. You really need to go back to the value level. And that kind of feels like the long way around. It's a lot of thinking, it's a lot of digging, but it's also where the treasure sits in a sense. So deeply, you can really rethink the world and really look at what you've done until now in a different light and realize the assumptions, revisit those assumptions if they're not good anymore. So going back all the way to the value level is kind of key in this whole story. And in a way, it's a kind of applied philosophy, if you want to say. It is really going back to values and rebuilding the world in a different way. An interesting side effect of that is that, well, if you're looking at complexity, one of the things with complexity is that it's really restless. There's always lots of things happening on the surface, on that action level. And if you keep reacting to everything on the action level, you go mad and you drive everybody else mad, basically. Going back to the value level, values don't change so much. They're always there. They're always the underlying drivers of the things that we do. So that's a much calmer, much wiser level to be thinking about things and to rethink things and to understand what has happened on the action level. So you don't have to react to everything on the action level anymore because you've got a deeper sense of what is really at play and you can respond to whatever happens from that deeper sense and that deeper understanding. And that's why it's important, and that's why sort of organizations that pick this up also become less restless and they become wiser in the way they approach the world because they just have access to, okay, we know, we understand on a deep level the underlying values that are at play. As I said, this project was started for the city of Sydney. In the end, one of the things that the city of Sydney did is, so the project got started by a unit which was basically a crime prevention unit, Safe for Sydney, and they rebranded themselves and rethought themselves to be about the nighttime economy. I think that's an interesting one because you're then talking about something that you actually want, that you want to create, but that you need to shape. And they created this Open Sydney strategy, which I think it's old by now, but it's still a really, really good piece of work. Lots of research gone into it to understand what the city is like at night and how can you actually create a better version of your city at night. From this also came a whole network around the world of mayors of the night. So people that look at the city at the city from a night perspective, because we build a city for use during the day, but the night use is so different that you really need to look at it differently. So there's about 80 of these mayors of the night around the world now in many big cities doing good work, really sort of understanding deeply what is at play with the city at night and not just seeing it as a bad version of the city during the day, but more or less reinventing it for the night, which I think is a really great result from just thinking differently, just taking a different approach, and suddenly the world opens up and it becomes a positive intervention rather than a planning and control or negative intervention. But as I said, well, a problem with sort of normally with design is that design tends to be sort of hemmed in by being sort of defined, but also funded through projects. So a design project starts with a briefing and then it ends with a result. And that result gets implemented and gets sold, and that's it. But if we're talking about these complex issues, and then King's Cross is not even the most complex issue that the world has to deal with, but it is one. The problem is that sort of these projects are nice, but in themselves, they don't change the world. And we do need the world to change. We do need different systems. We do need to look at the bigger game in this. So normally what you do when you do a project is, let's say you do a reframing project, look at the bottom, which means that you act and you reflect on that and you get insights and you envision new actions and things to do, and you sort of go around in this circle in projects, doing project after project after project, which is really great. It's what my friend Charles Leadbeater would call the washing machine. It goes around and it has good local impact. But actually, impact-wise, what you're looking for is changing the practices in the organization. I think lots of kudos to the City of Sydney as an organization to say, well, okay, it's a nice project that you've done at King's Cross, and they could have left it at that, but they actually changed their practices. And in a way, what you want to achieve is not just that the practice changes, but if you've got a really good radical reframing, that probably also should impact the strategy of an organization, the structure of an organization, and perhaps the way a whole sector works. I mean, what is the role of a municipality in these kind of things? So this is really what you're trying to achieve by doing those projects. Because if you know that if those projects land in an organization that really gets it, that will spark new projects and will spark a whole development. So we're being ambitious here, saying we've got a really good, wonderful reframe to move that forward all the way up to the sector level. Talking to this, going, okay, what is the problem here? It doesn't work, basically. You can't get from these actions that you do and from these reframing projects all the way up to sector level change. You get stuck just above practices, basically because strategies are not determined bottom up, but they're determined top down. So you're actually in the wrong process in a sense. And that's a real problem because, hey, you've got these wonderful ideas. Why don't they get it? Why don't they understand how important this is? This should really be changing, da da da. And it sort of almost invariably doesn't because they're not used to picking this up top down, in a top down process. So what we've learned to do over the years is to say, well, actually, if we want that top down process to also change, what does a sector learn from? How does a sector learn? And you say, well, actually, a sector, let's not make any assumptions about a sector or an organization being innovative in and of itself, but it is adaptive to what it sees as its relevant environment, its field, kind of the playing field that we're in, as a metaphor. I think, well, actually, that's an interesting one because if we can change the perception of the field, then they will start to move with their change of perception. So what we need to do is really sort of push forward and go, okay, these insights, especially the insights that don't get implemented in the project because they're too radical, are kind of pointers to how we should be thinking differently about this whole field. And the field, briefly, it consists of, there's a paradigm in there. So what is the way of thinking. There's a narrative in there. How do things hang together? There's a whole infrastructure of how this is how we do things. And there's disciplines in there that are defined in a certain way and that are also holding the field together. So the field is more or less the normal and the slowly changing normal. But what we can do with these insights from these projects is actually start influencing that narrative, influencing those stories. And if you do that right, then you're getting a top-down change and a bottom-up change that can be synchronized with one another. And that's when it really happens. That's when change, because change in systems only happens when almost all of the levels of the system change. That's when they all start to move. Especially around that cross. Let's say if you're looking at organizationally at what is the level where that cross sits, where things normally get stuck, that tends to be the level of middle management, more or less. Because there is always a bit of freedom to think in the top of an organization. There's always a bit of freedom and freedom for improvisation in the bottom of an organization where you're dealing with the real world, because you have to make do, you have to make sure that it works. But in the middle of the organization is where an organization basically sets itself. So the roles and responsibilities of people in middle management are based on the current way of thinking and the current way of working. So if you come from the bottom up with something that is completely different, they can't say yes. They're really nice people, but they can't say yes to things that are so weirdly different from how their own roles are defined. There is no single budget that will cover all of the things that you want to change, etc., etc. So that's where you get stuck. But and let's say the frustration that I'm talking about now, being a designer, doing these projects, and why don't they get it? Why can't I get up the food chain? Also plays out the other way, because people in an organization see, in the leadership of an organization, see that the field is changing, they really need to move. But the only thing that they often do is change the structure of the organization or come up with a new strategy for the organization. While what they really want to change, of course, are the practices. There needs to be new practices to deal with the issues that are coming up in the field. But if those practices aren't there, people will just do whatever they did and call it by a different name, or it's in a different structure, but we're not going to change what we're doing. So there's also a frustration, a top-down frustration, that we're not reaching what people actually do by all the change programs and all the horrible things we sometimes send organizations through, restructurings, etc. Because if there's no new practices, people wouldn't know what to do as a response to a new strategy or a new structure. So it's really bringing this whole system in movement, making it start to move in sync, is really important. And what we find is that if you do that well, then change actually can be really rapid. And a lot of the problems that you had before, sort of how the trouble of getting up into the food chain, etc., just doesn't play out anymore because things are already moving. Things are already in flux. And let's sort of use a second case study as an example of how this works. And this is one of the biggest that I've worked on. This is in the Netherlands, because the picture you see is farmers protesting. Because what happened in the Netherlands? The Netherlands is a signatory to the Paris Climate Agreement, and a very clever Dutch NGO actually pulled the government into court and saying, well, actually, the fact that we signed the Paris Climate Agreement means that we need to stick to it, right? It actually means that the Paris Climate Agreement is now Dutch law, isn't it? And the government basically said, well, no, it's an international treaty and you do a little bit of a thing here and there, but you don't want to do more than neighbors, etc., etc. And that went all the way over a couple of years up to the highest court in the Netherlands. And on the 19th of May 2019 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the highest court in the Netherlands, so there's no appeal possible, the highest court in the Netherlands says, yes, they're absolutely right. This is now Dutch law, effective immediately. Which meant that if you're looking at the problem that this NGO was dealing with was nitrogen pollution. So nitrogen gets emitted through transport, through building works, and through a large part through agriculture. The thing with nitrogen is it's an incredible fertilizer. So, and if that lands in nature reserves, then you're changing nature in the nature reserve. And under the Paris Climate Agreement, you're not allowed to do that. So nitrogen emissions had to be cut down in the Netherlands immediately. Otherwise, the government would be in breach of its own laws, basically. And the government could go to jail for that. So what happened was that 18,000 building works that were going on throughout the country had to be stopped immediately. Their permissions were void, basically. The maximum speed in the country for cars had to be brought down from 130 kilometers an hour to 100 kilometers an hour. And basically 2/3 of Dutch agriculture was illegal from that moment on. And the farmers weren't happy, obviously, and protested. And these are the kind of things that happened for week after week after week. And if the farmers weren't protesting, the builders were protesting, bringing their biggest gear and very, very slowly traveling to The Hague, blocking the whole country, blocking the whole economy, basically. So this is what a crisis looks like. And it's not pretty. It's not pretty at all. We were asked to look at this differently because the government realized that it had actually over the years more or less been a co-creator of this problem. And what we did is we went in and basically talked to a lot of people, talked to a lot of farmers, and looking at, okay, what is actually the matter here? What are the paradoxes? Why is this stuck? So we're looking, where does the stuckness come from? Not because we're going to be able to resolve that, but that's where new approaches are needed. That's where reframing is needed. That's where we need to pinpoint our creativity. That's where the newness needs to sit. We're talking about change here, but not superficial change. We're talking about deep change. So where does it actually sit is a really important question to tackle with. And so the picture you see is actually, this is agriculture in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is the second biggest exporter of food in the world after the US. And of course, the Netherlands is tiny, so agriculture is incredibly intense. These are greenhouses. You see the lights because they're actually day and night. So there's lights in the evening, so to make sure that the plants keep growing. And it's a very, very heavy industry. It's very high tech, but it's also very polluting. The Netherlands has 18 million people. It's got about 4 million cows. It's got about 40 million pigs. It's got about 250 million chickens. It's a really, really intense thing. So basically what you have is a very heavy industry out in the open in a densely populated country. There's no way that that is sustainable. So there is a kind of sense that, yeah, no, we've become very good at this. We've optimized and optimized and optimized. We've also maximized it to a point where it's not good anymore, and we really need to rein this back and think of a different way of doing this. But the way that had been sort of discussed to that point was very much about a zero-sum game. So you've got either nature or agriculture, and you can't have both. And there was really no contact except for shouting between the agricultural sector and the food sector and the people that were in favor of more nature. So there was really no contact except for a very polarized discussion, which wasn't a proper discussion at all. So that zero-sum game is an important one. What do you do? The second one was that, of course, the government had seen this coming in a way, and they tried to preempt this by getting more farmers to become more eco-friendly in the way they approach things. And so they created this whole structure of small subsidies that you could get to move in that direction, sort of ease the sector into becoming more eco-friendly and less polluting and less intense. And we were talking to one of the farmers that actually made the move to becoming an eco farmer. And he said, well, yes, I've made the move and I'm happy that I did it. But when there's a meeting from the Farmers Association, nobody wants to sit at my table anymore because I'm a traitor. And my kids actually don't get play dates in the village anymore because we're completely shut out. I think, okay, wait a minute. So it's not a small thing that we're asking people to do, easing into. It's really a step change of something that you're doing. And that has to do with the pride of being a good farmer, which is very much associated with the current way of working, of course. So if you suddenly work differently, then you're calling into question people's abilities, or that's how they feel it. And because they've often been on the land for generations, it's not just what they are doing that you're calling into question, but also what their parents were doing and their grandparents were doing. So it's actually it's almost seen as a very deep insult, the fact that you're doing things differently. So you're talking about a completely different type of change than what the government had tried to ease along. This is really a step change and it needs to be dealt with differently. You can only get to this by sitting at kitchen tables in farms forever, talking and just trying to find out, okay, to that value level, what's important to you? What do you feel? Where are things stuck for you? Um, of course, if you're looking at it as a problem field, all these people are shouting that they want their way, but something will need to happen in the middle. No, none of the parties actually has the key to resolve this conflict. They really need to start talking to one another. They really need to start engaging with one another respectfully and create something that works. In a sense, it makes this a design problem. A lot of these very complex issues are actually design problems. Um, but it's not just a complex issue. In this case, it's also a hyper complex issue. It means that there's complexity, but there's also layers to this. So if you're looking at it, you can roughly say that there's 4 different worlds. So there's the biosphere, nature, where our food comes from, etc., etc. There's the life world of the farmers. There's the systems world with the world of organizations. And there's a policy world, of course, where the government sits and tries to organize things around this system and try to move it into a better state. But if you're looking at this as a hyper complex system, you realize that, okay, there's actually no links between these different layers. So we are gonna need to do things that actually link these layers together. But an issue there is that these layers live on different time frames. So if you actually want to change the biosphere, so have nature sort of flourish and change itself, so plants create a different soil and there's next plants coming up, you're talking about more or less 40 to 50 years of sort of having a well-established part of nature there. If you talk about the life world of the farmers, they very, very much talk in terms of generations, because that's always the question of, are my kids going to take over the farm, etc., etc. So their life world sits in that sort of generation time frame of about 20 years. Now, if you look at the world of systems and organizations, they don't think ahead much more beyond 5 years, and more often it's 2 or it's even shorter. So there's a very short time frame there. And on the policy level in this case, because the ministry was panicking, they started creating new rules about every couple of months for the whole sector to try and influence this system. So we basically had to go back to the government and say, well, you're too quick, which is something they'd never heard before. But that you're actually messing things around. This is a system it's about generational changes that we're talking about. They need to be designed as generational changes. You can't just fix it with a new policy here and a new policy there and a new policy there, because you're just driving everybody mad and you're not in the end changing much at all by doing that. So understand the system, understand the layers of the system, but also understand the rhythm of the system and be realistic about how you can change it and what you can do. And we know hyper complex problems. So these are the sustainable development goals that are more or less set in the same kind of layers. And thinking of them in layers and thinking about creating connections between these layers and feedback loops between these layers is really the way to go forward. So that's a very subtle way of then approaching this, because if you want to change a system, you need to create these interventions. Creating an intervention is a design question. Oh, by the way, this is sort of, if you're talking about generations and farms, This was on the floor in one of the farms that we were sort of interviewing people. So the next generation was already playing with Lego and playing farm, of course. So this is how committed people are. And that's also one of the reasons that sort of talking to the farmers, they had no respect at all for the nature people. Basically saying, well, they have an idea about what nature is and et cetera, et cetera. But they go home at 5 o'clock in the evening. We live here. This is our life. And I must say that I've gotten to know farmers sort of, if you look at them as entrepreneurs, they're really flexible and they've gone through many, many changes over the years and they're quite flexible in doing things. But it's also their life world at the same time. So while, and if you forget that, or if you ignore that, you're ignoring the root cause of why the problem gets stuck. And that's the fact that it is a systems world thing, but also a life world thing that you need to be dealing with in a very respectful and good way. And you can't just dismiss people for doing things wrong, because that's where the conflicts come from. That's when people feel absolutely stuck. And one of the things that the government then said is, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to buy out farms that are too polluting, et cetera, because we need less farming. But then if you look at this on a regional level, there's a lot of developments in the regions that are happening already. And it's not just about getting rid of some farms or whatever. It is actually about, okay, what does this region, what should it look like in the future? And what is the role of food production in that future? You really need to look at it again as a design problem rather than just getting rid of something that you don't want. We were also at some point interviewing 25 people who were sort of being educated to become a farmer, so the prospective new farmers. And out of the 25, only 3 were sort of had made a decision to really become a farmer. And 22 were kind of on the fence about it because economically it's not that great. You're not looked at positively in society, et cetera, et cetera. There's more troubles ahead. The government is pushing you around with all these rules. And so they were really not sure whether they would do it. And you go, okay, we might actually end up, if we keep this negative discussion going on, with too few farmers in the country. That's not a good idea either. We really need to look at more holistically about what kind of country are we making when we're doing this. This is not a problem for the farming sector, it's a societal issue. And you probably need just about all of society to help resolve this kind of issue. What we found, if we're talking about what is important here, which theme can we use to start bringing those discussions together in the system, we ended up talking about vitality as an important thing. Because in a way, digging deeply, sort of sitting with people, thinking it was all about the vitality of their organizations, or the vitality of their lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. So vitality is an interesting thing that people had in common, and they meant something different by it. But creating a discussion around what's the vitality of this region in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, and how can you contribute to the vitality of the region was a really good discussion to have. And people started finding each other there. So that became kind of the guiding light of a lot of the discussions initially. And you could then start to make this learning cycle, because there's things we don't know, there's things that need to change. So you need a learning cycle, which sits between the professional world and society, between doing and reflection, and then create projects that actually sort of support this learning cycle. Because a problem with the learning cycle is that when there's one step missing, nothing much gets learned. So it needs to be complete. So what we did is use that as a guiding light to go, okay, this is where we need projects. These are the links that need to be made. And let's just create projects, not because they're the solution, but because they create the feedback loops and the links that we know we're going to need in the future. Because, it's the nitrogen crisis now, but you can actually see that in a couple of years, there's going to be a water shortage problem. And then there's that problem, and then there's that problem. And it's always these same parties that will have to sit around the table and do things. So creating these feedback loops, making sure that people meet each other in projects really helps a lot. Just gonna cough a little. So please note with this that this is a sorry. Recovering from a cold. Okay. Please note that this is about vitality and not resilience. So resilience has been bandied around a lot in this kind of space. But you go, well, resilience is actually, it's an existing system that's able to bounce back from a disturbance. When you talk about vitality, you're much more clearly talking about the future. And you're talking about creating something that can keep sustaining itself, keeps itself alive. So that has a sensitivity to the outside world, that has an internal coherence, is flexible enough, etc., etc., etc. So resilience is not what you want in these kind of things. In the future, you actually want that vitality. Also important to note is that a lot of these, especially if you're talking about transitions, people talk about very large scale change that needs to happen. And it's always in 10 years time, we need to be sort of carbon neutral, etc. So that's the L here. And then these people have big stories, have good ideologies about what should happen, but those are not very actionable. So they then go to design and say, well, design can do these things because design is about innovation. It is about creating these new things. But then design sits on the S side, where design normally, traditionally, has a very short time span. It's about projects, so it's a year, maybe 2 years or whatever. But there's no guarantee that doing these smaller projects and these shorter projects actually leads to that big change after all. So there's this space in the middle that we still need to think about, okay, how do we make sure that we get from one to the other? So that's a strategic space, and it's a space of continuous change and learning, etc., etc. So, and that's where design maybe has some really interesting and good practices, but other fields have practices too that we're going to need to become that kind of strategic change engine in the middle that actually gets you from the S to the L in a good way. So the middle ground is sort of where the battle is won or lost. And design in itself, traditionally where design comes from, is not the solution per se. And it requires deep change. So what we've been doing, talking to these farmers, looking at these systems, is continuously going back to what is this about? What are the underlying values? What is important here that's embodied in a certain way now? What other ways of doing this can we think of? So we're not questioning people's values or saying that they should have different values, but we're looking at, okay, how can that value that has been done in a certain way be done in a different way that has less unwanted side effects or that doesn't sort of create havoc, basically. So going back to that deep value level is the bedrock where you need to be. And talking about continuous change, we realize that, okay, you actually need several activities to create that change and to keep a learning cycle going. So you need a lab because you need to be able to do experiments. You need an academy because you need to be able to learn and also to spread your lessons around. You need a podium because you need to get out into the world and get criticized, have your assumptions being sort of questioned and challenged, etc. Otherwise, it becomes a self-sustaining little internal circle. And you need a temple because this is actually about change, but it's also about changing yourself. So it's not innovation is for others because they should be behaving differently. No, this is how can we be different? And I found that that needs to have a rhythm and that rhythm is more or less defined by these podium moments where you say, well, actually we need to make sure that we bring this together every now and then because we're not talking about a project that ends. We're talking about growth. We're talking about development. And if you don't actually every now and then take stock, you don't realize what you're doing. And you don't realize when it's out of whack or not out of whack. And the whole idea of rhythm actually came from sort of being involved in the Design Academy in Eindhoven. It's a good design school that at some point got in the press as is the best design school in the world. New York Times said that. And then I was heading up the education committee there internally. And I just pulled everybody together and okay, if we're good at all, I'm not sure whether we're the best in the world because that's a strange thing to say, but if we're good at all, what makes us good? Or what creates quality in what we're doing? And then we realized that with the Design Academy in Eindhoven, they've got 2 podium moments in the year. So one in spring, the spring on the Northern Hemisphere. So in April is the Salone del Mobile in Milano, where they always have a big presence. And in October, there's the Dutch Design Week, where they've got their graduation show, and they're one of the main things there. So what actually happens is that you go to Milano, you do whatever you do, you wake up the next morning after having been there and done things and still a bit hungover, and you immediately have this fear of, oh shit, in half a year we need to be out there again. What are we going to do? What is it going to look like? Who should be interested? What discussions do we want to spark with the things that we're doing? So you're continuously on your toes. You're continuously having a quality discussion in your organization. If you didn't have those podium moments, if you didn't have that rhythm, that would all sort of disappear in all the daily things that you need to sort out and do. So these podium moments are actually really important because they pull things together. And they're not so much podium moments about what did we do and report on what we did, but actually they're forward looking. What discussions, who should be involved, what do we want to discuss with these people, what is going to set us up for the next half year or year, rather than look at making them retrospective. And I think it's a kind of a key thing. If you don't have that rhythm, you can have these activities and it will just be too slow and not very exciting. And the quality will start to slip because you can always delay things. The question is, how do you do this? How do you organize these things? And I started looking around sort of in my own world about, okay, who does this well, basically? What kind of organizations do we know that actually have continuous change as part of their DNA? And they're coherent, they're not chaotic, but they do change all the time. And looking around, I realized that actually sort of design agencies, owners of design agencies, partners of design agencies, do this kind of stuff all the time because they're not there as managers in a business sense. They try to create a context in which their type of projects can happen. And especially in the bigger agencies, the last thing you want is the boss to actually intervene in the project because then everybody else stops thinking. You really need to create an environment that can keep changing and can keep flourishing in this way. And we interviewed a number of these people, sort of famous architects, Norman Foster, Santiago Calatrava, in this case, Ken Young, and just asking them, what do you do in your firm, actually? How do you create this? And we realized that there's a whole level of design practices that we've hardly mapped at all. What these people are doing, it's still designing, but it's designing the environment in which a certain type of projects can happen. And they're using competition strategically to challenge their staff. They're very particular about which are the projects that you have on the walls in the studio, because those need to be the projects that you still want to think about, not the wildly successful ones, but the ones that are challenging. Be good to have that in their peripheral vision of the people in the studio. Talking with Norman Foster, he basically said, well, one of the problems we have here is HR, because we are Norman Foster Associates. Every architect that applies to a job here is brilliant, basically. The portfolios are so beautiful. They sort of make you cry. And in a job interview, everybody does really well. But we actually need people that can understand what we're doing and, in a sense, toe the line and contribute to that, but also challenge it in the right way. Not destructively challenging, but you do want these people to bring new things into this space. And to, in the end, challenge that space too, but do it in a way that is productive. And so he said, we basically hire everybody for 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks is basically too long. Within 2 days, you know whether somebody's got that kind of the right attitude and the right way of dealing with what we are already doing and can challenge that in a way that makes sense to us and can help us forward. So they really have a lot of practices on that higher level of designing that are really wonderful and that you would need in this kind of studio to keep changing. And this is Jerry Hirschberg, he's from product design, and he basically says, well, he's written a little book called The Creative Priority, saying, well, let's organize ourselves around creativity as a priority. So normally organizations are organized around efficiency and um, production, basically, exploitation of things that we already know. But he's, well, if creativity really is our priority, we do need abrasion. We don't need efficiency. We need people to be in different cognitive styles, working together and challenging each other all the time. So he really builds up a completely different type of organizational structure and organizational practices based on maximizing friction in an organization rather than minimizing it. My good friend Alex Coles wrote a book, The Transdisciplinary Studio. He's a journalist and also an anthropologist, and he really embedded himself in some artists and designer studios for months on end, interviewing everybody around. So, for instance, this is Olafur Eliasson, who's a really famous artist. And if you're looking at these big artist studios, they hire their own art critics because they realize that what they make is going to be part of a discussion, but they need to understand the discussion. In this case, Olafur Eliasson, he's got basically his workshop where he makes stuff. He's got the stuff that he experiments with. He also hosts part of the Art Academy of Berlin in his studio because he needs that academy because you get different questions that are being asked there. So it's a really interesting way of creating an ecosystem that is not about production of artworks, but is about change and is about being thoughtful. It is about understanding some sort of adopting a frame, working with it for a while, but also being able to then adopt a new frame and move on to that one. So I think there's really something there that kind of knowledge that these people have that we need much more of, because if we want to create these kind of mechanisms for continuous change in a sector, and it could be a food sector or all of our sectors are up for grabs at the moment, then you need this kind of thinking, you need this kind of working. What you don't need is endless pilot projects for all kind of little interventions and things. That really needs to be brought together into a continuous change program. So I guess that's where, if I look at the Deep Change book, that ends with a model of what a studio could look like and some examples about where we already building these studios. In the city of Amsterdam, for instance, they're really building a studio about change in a big area of the city that is under a lot of social stress at the moment. And it works. It really, really works, these kind of things. And I think it's one of the ingredients of dealing with these bigger issues in the world is this type of way of working. And coming from design, you suddenly have this sense that, hey, we're sitting on a gold mine here in a sense, but it's not designing as we know it. We really need to change our own ways of working to make this happen in the world. Hence our move from design to complexity to transdisciplinarity to really say, well, okay, wait a minute, if we want to deal with this, design has something to offer here in an open way, also saying, well, other disciplines have things to offer too, but we need to pull these together. And I think design with this kind of studio model can create a kind of framework or context in which these practices can then come together. And if we combine those two models, then, well, I guess a studio would sit right in the middle of the game changers model, the top-down, bottom-up model, because of course you need a studio where things are stuck. So you need the people that are in middle management to be engaged in, on the one hand, looking at, okay, what are the things in the field that are there now and how are they changing? And on the other hand, initiating projects that are strategic then for changing the field. so that the projects that you normally get to do because there's a briefing and you can, if you've got some freedom, you can reframe. They need to be done much more strategically to really feed the discussions in the field and create systems change in that way. So it requires change not on an organizational level. It's not about restructuring organizations or whatever. It's not about one transition. As soon as you start talking about the food system, you're talking about land values in the country, you're talking about where people live in the country, etc. I mean, everything starts to shift. So all of these transitions need to be brought together. And you really need to build something that is open, complex, dynamic, and networked, like a studio, to be the mechanism to actually move this forward. And that's the end of what I wanted to say. I can finally stop sharing.
Thank you
Everybody's
so
there.
much, Kees. Thank you so much, Kees. So I'd like to invite people on the call, if you would like to ask a question, to raise your hand and turn on your camera, and I'll give you a shout out. But Kees, while people are maybe formulating their question, you're now at Princeton University and you're applying this through the teaching there. How's it going? Are people picking it up and running with it as we did in Sydney?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the time is ripe for these kind of things. I find it funny sort of giving this talk where you realize that it's getting shorter and shorter in a way. There's less, you don't have to explain to people that the problems of the world are complex. We realize that. That's our reality. That's what we live in. And but you can also see how people are not as hopeful as they should be, in a sense. Because if you don't see a way forward, if you're just overwhelmed by the problems of the world, then it just becomes very depressing if you don't see a possibility for action. And what this does is at least give a through view of possibilities for action. And I think that's important now because we don't need pessimism at the moment. We just need to get on with it. And it is very tricky. I mean, this is the hard stuff. It's nice to think about new things. It's nice to come up with a brilliant frame, etc. Going for deep change means that you need to deal with whatever is there. So I've been dealing sort of one of the problems, for instance, if you're talking about that nitrogen issue, people talk about, well, we need to system change. I say, well, actually, being a philosopher, you go, a system consists of elements and relationships, and the important relationships are actually feedback loops, because that's how a system can learn. But in this system, what they call the food system, there are no feedback loops.
Yeah.
So effectively, there is no system, actually. You first have to create the system before you can change it. Otherwise, there's no learning. Otherwise, it's just still little projects and elements of what could be changed, but it can never land because there's not enough feedback loops. So, I mean, those kind of things, you just have to, you run into a situation and you deal with what's there, or you're dealing with an organization and you realize that, okay, this requires people to build different relationships with one another that weren't there before, but there's no trust in the organization. Then you first need to deal with trust, because otherwise your assumption is wrong and it's never going to get anywhere. So it is the hard work. Nothing about this is quick. Nothing about this is easy. But it is wonderful to see things starting to move. I mean, basically, people came to us from the city of Sydney because King's Cross was this unsolvable problem that had been a problem for about 150 years. And then creating with a new approach a way forward for this problem to at least start shifting is an absolutely great thing to be doing for them and also for the people who are doing it, of course.
Yeah. Just in the chat, Katie from the UK said, brilliant. Thank you. Had to head off. Really found your introduction to sum up the zeitgeist and the case study is very helpful. Thank you for that, Katie. We do have a number of people who've raised their hands for questions. I'll go in as it's presented to me on the screen. Aristina, welcome. Could you turn your camera on if possible and pose your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, like every time when House of Complexity arrange this kind of event, is always thought-provoking. And Kees, thank you so much. Learned so much, lots to reflect. And I really enjoyed how you explain this with real life business problems and how to solve it. So maybe my question sounded too big, but when you mentioned about hyper complexity, I immediately thought of retail industry. Multiple layers, intangible and tangible network or connection. And there are just lots of problems that's pending to be solved. So would you be able to give a quick advice or your thoughts on how to solve some of those problems in retail industry, please? Thank you.
Well, I sort of can't, but what I can do is sort of tell you how I would approach it. And I guess sometimes when people are confronted with complexity, they want to control it somehow. So they start making maps, kind of system map of these are the partners, these are the relationships, this is the nature of the relationships, etc., etc. Analyzing their way towards a solution somehow. I guess in these really complex issues, that doesn't work anymore because those maps are out of date before they're finished, if they would ever be finished. So what you need to do in these kind of situations is basically start acting. Sort of push the system a little bit and then you see what reacts. And what will show up red on your screen then are the important relationships that you really should be taking care of. And other relationships are also there, but they're maybe less poignant or less important at that moment in time. So it is just important to, but it's also really interesting to look at existing projects or things that have been done before or earlier attempts at innovation in this industry and see where it all gets stuck, because that sort of highlights the important relationships that you really need to deal with and the important paradoxes that the system suffers from. Where, and I didn't stress that too much maybe, but it's really important to realize that a lot of these paradoxes are always there and they're always going to be there. So it's not about solving the paradox because you can't. Let's say in every organization there's a paradox between continuity and change. But that's kind of a force field that people keep in place too, and it's really important. It's just that sometimes when you need to act, you need to choose one over the other for a little while. But as soon as you do that, you need to make sure that you keep the other one that you're not choosing alive, because you're going to need it later in a way. So seeing problems in that way helps a lot, and seeing the important relationships and the paradoxes that we are living with, and again, taking a podium, talking to people about that, so that they can react on it and reflect on it, so you know that you've got a complete set of paradoxes to deal with. And these paradoxes then become your creative spaces where you say, we've got one force, we've got another force, they're not going to move. How can we think about this differently? How can we reframe so that we've got a different approach into this space is the important one, which is actually something I learned sort of during running that master's degree program with Roger that Stephen was one of the victims of, is that sort of the paradoxes turned out to be much more important than I thought. But when you see them working with these paradoxes, you realize that they exactly show you where you need your creativity. They exactly show you where you need to dig deep. So finding that is important. Systems maps on the whole, they're nice. They're often very colorful and very impressive, but they're not a way to approach these things. They don't help that much in that sense.
Certainly, as first victim, aka course director, that was an interesting thing to come out of the work with the participants, because I'd been treating paradoxes completely differently, something to walk around and come back to later, perhaps. But yeah, the importance of them definitely emerged. Brian, you have a question.
Yes, I do. Hi, Kees. Nice to see you again. I saw you in Edinburgh recently, and
Yeah.
always good to see you. I'll keep it short. I think it's about when you're reframing, and I guess the question is about what resistance do you encounter when you're reframing. So, for instance, in the King Cross example, you may be doing some of the police might be seeing themselves as being done out of a job or something like that. So that sort of resistance to the reframing is what I'm curious about.
Yeah, of course that exists. On the whole, it's often much less than you think, because you are actually, if you, I mean, what we tend to do in these situations with different stakeholders is to sit down with everybody individually first to really understand what people's values are, what drives people, and you're not questioning those values. The only thing that you're questioning is we're doing it in this way now, and I completely understand and respect that we're doing it in this way now because this is where we come from. These are the things that have changed. This requires something else. Can you be part of that something else? And so respecting people, taking them along as much as possible is often enough. Especially if people really feel it as a problem. Of course, you've also people that have a vested interest in the problem being there and have a vested interest in problem being tackled in a certain way. In the end, I've learned to more or less ignore that. Just do the new thing, put lots of spotlights on it, and make it attractive for them to just jump on that. Often there's not that much energy with the current way of working anymore. And in a sense, so people will then start to move, but not everybody is a mover. I think there's a danger with these kind of projects is that you focus on the people that don't move or don't want to move and engage with them quite a lot, and because that then becomes your mission. And if they feel that, they know that the only thing they have to do to actually scupper everything that can happen is just keep saying no. And you're going to put more energy into that, etc. So I tend to ignore them, go around them for a little while, and then try to take them along later. But not spend too much time and energy on them, because otherwise your whole project is going to be about counterforces rather than about creation. Part of it's the responsibility of the organizations we work with to deal with their own internal counterforces. From the outside, I can't effectively do that. So I guess that's the strategies that we've developed up that seem to be working well for us, and not always. And sometimes you have to say, well, maybe the time wasn't ripe, or the situation looked like there could be ready for change. I mean, the good thing that was in Holland with the nitrogen crisis, horrible crisis that it is that there was a sense that we can't go on like this. Also with maximizing food production in a very crowded country, there is a limit to that. And that almost harks back to sort of 1972, the Club of Rome report, sort of limits to growth, it was called. And Holland was a country where that was a bestseller. So it's already in the culture from a long time ago that yes, there is something that growth in itself can't be good. Coming from a very small and densely populated country, you realize that you don't have infinite amounts of space to deal stuff in. Which also makes it interesting for me to still do projects and work in the Netherlands, because other countries, of course, also have a nitrogen crisis. Because they're not that densely populated, it's not that extreme. It doesn't come to a head there, so it's not seen as a crisis. But in the end, they'll have to deal with the same kind of issues. So things that I can learn in an extreme situation, I think are lessons that can be spread more widely to other places where at the moment it's not a crisis yet, in a sense.
Yeah. I'd only add to that case that having an authorized environment is really crucial. Back in the days of King's Cross, when I was actually at the Department of Justice trying to bring in
Roger was on the wrong side, basically. Roger was on the bureaucratic side and crime prevention and blah, blah, blah. So he was sort of wearing black then and breathing very heavily. Yeah. That was Roger as I got to know him.
Wearing ties and suits.
Yeah.
Yeah, but just the way, Case, you set up designing out Crime Research Centre with the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Justice, with an advisory board that had senior police, senior people from the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, it gave an authorized environment for you to be asking those questions in a different way, and also then to have a process and to be able to be explicit with the participants in the process about where we are in the process, and it may feel uncomfortable now, but wait until 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, kind of thing. That all helped as well. Thanks, Brian, for the question.
Yeah.
Morteza.
Hello. Thank you very much, Kees. Great discussion and presentation. The question that I have is from a pedagogical side of view. Like the philosophy very nicely fits the time, but how can we bring this to a classroom, a studio that needs to go from week 1 to week 12 or 13? What would be your approach to define that for a studio of a bunch of students and get it working in that context?
Well, sort of, for instance, what I've done at Princeton, which is a fairly extreme example because they're sort of elite students, but I start out by realizing that, okay, this is, if I want people to understand framing, they have to understand their own frames or the frames that are implicit within their disciplines. So a lot of it starts with kind of realizing, okay, these are the rules that I more or less live by, or these are the metaphors that I use to describe the world. And then start opening it up, going, oh, well, this could be done differently. And then bring in an external partner with a real life issue. And then help them to go, okay, you're now going to interview that partner. Listen very carefully to what they're saying, but particularly listen very carefully to how they talk, because how they talk expresses the framing that they're using and the way of thinking that they're using. And students get really excited by this because it is a different way, or it is a different level of being in those kind of conversations. And it becomes a kind of superpower in the sense that you can then actually understand people in a way more deeply than they understand themselves, and deal with situations that may be difficult or conflictual from, I know where this comes from. These are the underlying values that are clashing here, or these are the underlying patterns of thinking that are clashing. So that's how I introduce it, and then move into framing, basically. So use this and have students maybe interview each other, etc., etc. So didactically really set it up as, okay, this is something that you're going to take away that helps you understand the issues that you're dealing with in complexity much more deeply than when you would just pick up a briefing and try to resolve it. So I guess that's the way I do it. So I don't introduce it so much as this is about design, because in this case, design practices are a means to an end, and the end is change. And understanding what holds us back from change means understanding deeply how people are thinking, what their mental models are, etc. So that's how I do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the great question. Rick, hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, it's great to see you.
Hi.
Cool stuff. I had a question about bringing together the idea of the studio and the podium and the field from my work, which is in sound and music and resounding stuff, and the idea of a jazz community. So if you might be thinking of designing the field, like you have a community of practice, like Miles Davis hanging out in the studio, but also on the podium, challenging his things, bringing in different characters from different worlds. But then this idea of hanging out in New York, whatever, with other people, not only artists and musicians, but also scientists or lawyers, whatever. Paying attention to connecting this idea of studio and podium with the field itself. So designing, taking care of the idea what a community of practice might mean from, say, something like a jazz perspective. What would be your response to that?
Now, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that when you do this, if we're talking about, especially if we're talking about these broad societal issues, you probably need practices from very unexpected angles, things where you wouldn't think sort of rationally that we need this now. So you need to create an environment, a community, which I hope also sort of lives around the house of complexity, where people inspire one another. But that means that you need time together that is not scheduled. It means that you need time together that is not dedicated to resolving something. But the hanging out stuff is really, really important because you learn things from one another through just discussing things and having little thought bubbles. And that's also part of, sort of, if you're talking about Olafur Eliasson's studio, the reason to have all these different disciplines in there is exactly this. Because if you're doing new things, you're actually not going to know exactly what you need. It's not a linear process. Of course, organizations have trouble creating this for themselves because they tend to want to schedule everything. So creating space for that kind of change, creating space for hanging out, is something we need to get a lot better at. And people use jazz musicians or improvisation as a metaphor quite a bit. And I think we should take it more seriously because it's often used a bit flippantly, just as a loose metaphor. But actually, so I've got one of the people that I work with is doing a PhD engaging with improvisation as a way of thinking. And he's not from jazz, but he's from sort of plays, sort of stage improvisation. And he said, well, the important thing in improvisation is you come together with a group of people that want to do it. And the important thing is that you have to let each other shine. You're opening up for the other to do their thing. As soon as somebody becomes very egoistic and very possessive about this is where we should be going, everybody else is disempowered. So it's a different kind of space to be in. And I think we need a lot of different ways to create those kind of spaces, these kind of indeterminate spaces in organizations, or hopefully sort of a strange call like this is that kind of space where ideas can actually cross-fertilize and mix and mingle. But we really, really need each other in these spaces. And you don't need a methodology, you don't need models, but you really, really need each other to help feed this. It is about inspiration. And so I was talking to my students in Princeton, and they wanted to present their stuff to the partner organizations, and went, well, we're actually not going to present an end result of a project. We're going to do a handover because we want these people to take our lessons and the things that we've made along into their processes. So what do you need? What do they need to bring this forward? And so it is a handover. It's not a final presentation. Yeah, so you have to think from the perspective of the other about what they need and how you can generously give to them what they need to take this forward. And it's not the last word. In many ways, it's the first word. And I think that's sort of where this different type of conversations that we need to have. We need to get better at saying, well, normally we have a very rational, pointed, linear conversation because something needs to be done. This is a completely different type of conversation. So what are the principles or what are the props or what do we need to bring in place to make this happen? A small side example before Roger shuts me off is that a PhD student of mine, she was user-centered design, started working at OC, which is part of Canon, so they make copiers. And sort of making copiers is, I mean, I've as a product designer myself, copiers are kind of hell on earth because they're really small. You've got high temperature, you've got ink, you've got natural materials in there, you've got high speed, it all needs to work, etc., and it's in a box this big. It's just sort of, so basically within that kind of design environment, it's really important that people are completely honest, completely straight, and that everything that needs to be talked gets talked about. So within their suite of conference rooms, within their design unit, above every conference table, there's this spring that comes down from the ceiling. And it is this very colorful toy elephant that hangs there in the wind, basically, in the airco. It sort of goes around it's the elephant in the room. And when you talk to each other, the thing is always there. So in your peripheral vision, it's really irritating to have that sort of going around all the time. But when you need to talk about the elephant in the room, you can actually pull it towards yourself. It's like a talking stick in Australia. And you've got the attention. Everybody else stops. This is what needs to be talked about. There's an elephant in the room. Because we can't live with that kind of vagueness or whatever. We really need to sort this out now. And then if you've done your talking and the discussion, you sort of hang it back and it goes back to doing its very, very irritating moving around. So it's just a prop, but it creates a different type of conversation. And I think even on that detailed level, you can talk about big changes, etc., etc., but it is always people, and it is always how people relate and how people interact. So finding inspiration in other ways of interacting that we may have in our sort of drive for efficiency and for being professional may have organized away from ourselves. We need to really sort of start reintroducing those because this is a different time, this is a different kind of issues, and that means that we need to deal with each other in a different way too.
Thank you for the question, Rick. Hello, Anna.
Hi there. Hi, Kees. Thanks so much for your talk, and thanks to House of Complexity for putting this on. I was really struck by how you distinguished between the guiding light of vitality, and you specifically said this is not resilience.
Yeah.
Do you see any usefulness in kind of using them together as a bit of a 1-2 punch, where you start with the notion of vitality, like what does a healthy vital system look like here? You know, what functions do we need it to perform? And once you've clarified that and you've worked towards that, would you then pair it with the notion of resilience? So now we've got our healthy vital system. How do we make it resilient to disruption? Do you see any benefit in kind of combining the ideas in that kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, thank you for the question. It makes me think. Damn it. It's really interesting because I guess vitality is about a fluency. And resilience is relative to an existing system or a possible system. So then things already have a shape. And with things that already have a shape or that you've decided about, even if it's just temporarily, that it could be something like this, then you can start talking about resilience and it's good. But if you only talk about resilience, you've got a problem because you're not moving away from the existing shape and the existing ways that things are done. It sort of ties in with sort of when we were doing this project with for the department in the Netherlands. There was we did in phase 1, which was lots of talking with people and sort of surfacing those paradoxes, and people were really, really enthusiastic. And then the money for phase 2 didn't sort of materialize very quickly at all. So at some point in slight desperation, we sort of called the ministry and said, hey, when can we go on? Because everybody wants to, everybody's enthusiastic, people are inspired, people feel listened to, and now nothing's happening. That's not good. And they said, oh yeah, no, it's going to be fine, but it's going to take a little while because we're managing the uncertainty. And I laughed at them in their faces, which is not a very diplomatic thing to be doing. But it's, of course, so you're completely mad. Risk you can manage, you can run away from. Uncertainty is something you have to go towards. And that's what the whole process, that's what the whole project is about, going towards uncertainty in a sense. But then we realize that, wait a minute, that's actually happening in a lot of organizations where everything that is uncertain gets managed as if it is a risk. And it isn't. So I think those kind of confusions that we've got in our organizations are really, really detrimental, because if anything that is uncertain gets managed down as a risk, then you can't move. You can forget about innovation, basically. So that's why I'm also making the distinction between resilience and vitality, going, okay, vitality is the bigger thing. And then, as you say, I think you're right that once you've got something, you can look at its resilience. But still, in the end, you need to make sure that once that is past its use-by date, you need to be able to jump back into the vitality discussion. So this is about taking decisions, even if temporarily, because we need decisions to base our actions on. So we do freeze things, but we just need to be able to unfreeze them again too when the situation demands that. Otherwise, you're stuck with it, basically. I talk about framing as a good thing, but it's actually always reframing that is the good thing, because a new frame, if it gets stuck again, will be just about as bad as the old frame, probably. So it is that ability to keep the change going.
Thank you, Anna, for the question and for making Kees think. Steve,
I just wanted to share from a personal experience the interesting thing about the question of vitality, especially when exploring it in an internal organization, is all of a sudden we're valuing people's personal and lived experience, and even just starting a conversation in that way can be really transformative, where we're just asking, what is it that makes you alive here, as opposed to the typical let's get all the problems, the negativity onto the table. And of course that creates I suppose a multiplicity, and it brings a richness, and all of a sudden we're talking about stories, and it's no longer just looking at data and the numbers or the market opportunity. So even that for me is the big shift. And of course when you recognize it is that as a process, the question of vitality is kind of never done. It's never complete, and it's always an opening, a start. And a part of a reframing process, it's one way that can catalyze a rich portfolio of different probes and different directions. So
and it actually was a funny incident in the ministry, that at some point one of the directors of the ministry in a later conversation basically said, "You guys with your vitality, it's really irritating. And every time I now look at a new strategy or a new policy, I keep thinking, is this good for vitality or not?" Which is the right thing to be thinking about, of course. Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Vanessa, hello.
Hello. Oh my gosh. You can thank you, Kees, so much. And the House of Complexity always stretches my thinking. You can tell I've been listening because the lights have gone off in the office, but that's how intently I've been focused. Two very pragmatic questions I hope you can help me with. One is I really enjoyed your reflections on the importance of the relationship system and how those feedback loops, and any insights you might have where you often find we're able to build those as individuals across different organizations and levels of government. But how do you do it with an organization as an entity? Because it can be exhausting to continue to rebuild those relationships and feedback loops. So there's any hints there around an organizational kind of as part of that loop. And the second was allowing space for discussion. I guess often what I've seen is there will be a group of maybe leaders whose mental models lend themselves to lots of space to think and ideate and reframe, and they're doing that quite a lot. And I'm trying to bridge them with a group of frontline workers working with community who would also like to be part of that discussion, but are quite, I guess, their scope is so much smaller in where they are. So anything that you've seen, how do I bridge those two groups?
Okay. So about the feedback loops, part of it is, let's say, I mean, I didn't touch upon it, but I think we need to make a distinction between organizing something and formalizing something. So in an organization, you've got the formal relationships and sort of the pyramid model, et cetera, with Stephen on top, of course, if you talk about House of Complexity. But those are transactional formal relationships, and they're always there to support the status quo in a sense, because you need a sense of stability, so that's what you do. If you want to try and create newness, you need different types of relationships. And I had a PhD student from Finland, actually, Tua Björklund, who did research because she was interested in how does an idea actually travel through an organization. And she looked at 40 organizations to see how does this work. But the literature in this kind of stuff tends to be American, and it was very much about product champions. So you've got a heroic male often who sort of fights against the organization and makes it happen and builds bridges, etc., etc. And so she was innocently looking for product champions within those Finnish organizations and couldn't find a single one. I think, oh, okay. Because what I mean, innovation is actually it's a relay race. People pick it up and people hand it over to the next person and the next person and the next person. But those networks are not the formal networks. Because let's say I work at a university, if I need something from marketing, I'm not sending an email to marketing@uts.edu.au. I'm calling the one person at marketing that I know understands what I'm trying to do and I know is going to help me. So it is these informal networks that actually run innovation in a sense. And it is important that you create those. So the organization that I just talked about in Canon with the stupid little elephant that goes like this, they also, when they welcomed her to her new job, her boss basically said, well, this is the team, shake hands with everybody, this is your desk, where are you going to be in half a year's time? Because first we've got this special assignment for you that we haven't been able to tackle as an organization at all. Anything you can do to help us is great, but it does require you to actually talk with lots and lots of people across the whole organization. So you're basically building up your network and your relationships before you take your role in that network of relationships. So, I mean, those are the kind of things that we need to get better at. And that's a question of organizing things and being very strict in organizing them and supporting them, but it's not formalizing them. Because as soon as you formalize, things get broken. Things become more transactional and things get lost, basically. So looking at an organization as what are the informal structures that actually make this tick, and who are the bridge builders or who are the important people that manage to do that relay race is absolutely crucial. And I think we need to get better at supporting that. And we need to get better at rewarding people for leading these kind of things. But it's not a single product champion that's going to sort of battle through an organization and despite the organization will create something, because that's a lot of energy lost. Sounds like a waste. We really need to support those relay race networks that are around. And it's really funny because people can just, the moment you ask people about it, they can just name their own informal network easily. And you can see how rich it is. Or you can see that actually there's an informal network, but there's one part of the organization that doesn't play ball or doesn't do the informal network stuff. Then that's where things will get stuck. Because if it is an innovation that is broad at all, you're going to probably need every part of the organization to shift or contribute to it at some point in time. So creating completeness in there is really important. Stimulating these things is important because it's where the thing can flow, actually. And you talked about space for discussion. It's more or less the same question in that sense. So how do you create different kinds of conversations where these kind of relationships can be made that really contribute to the fight?
We seem to have lost Kees. He is at home though in the Netherlands, so I'm sure he'll just log back on shortly.
It's a real cliffhanger.
Yeah, real cliffhanger. So Kees is currently living in New York while he works at Princeton, but it's conference season. As Brian said earlier, Kees was at a conference in Edinburgh, and he has a little shack in the woods near Ermelo in the Netherlands, which is where he's at today. So sure, he's just reconnecting. But I think, Vanessa, if I were to add to what Kees was saying, and knowing a little bit about the kinds of environments where there might be a formal separation of communication, where it isn't the convention to be able to have that frontline worker speak with the leadership. The way Kees and I and Steve and others have done it in the past is to create a safe space. When we were at UTS, that safe space could be around training or education, and creating a space where those formal barriers could be suspended for the day or for the week or for the program even, and then to create that space where the people themselves would participate, maybe in a hypothetical or maybe in an actual issue that their organization was facing. And so then you let the process take over, and the process to make that level playing field where the formal barriers to communication are overcome. And that's, it's a big nuance in the work that we see through the House of Complexity, creating that space and for people to be able to communicate freely, and to collaboratively reframe issues together. It's not an easy, straightforward one, but that would be my build on what Kees was saying. And Kees is back. Welcome back, Kees.
I got a message that I was removed from the meeting. I thought, is it something I said? Is it something? What have I done now, basically? Roger gets always so temperamental that he just you're gone, basically. Yeah.
Oh dear. Thank you for coming back. And thanks, Vanessa, for the question. Donatella, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Kees, and House of Complexity. I think so far my mind is just blown for how you are articulating all of this, and I relate very much to this. I'm also coming at a very right moment, like after the stop of connection, and every time I try to talk about this topic in organization, there's always a blackout, so on point. I was wondering, because I work again in same in continuous change, but more on the corporate organizational side, so trying to create transformation from controlling change to relating to change. And what you said about the first instinct to control that complexity is what I deal with the most, and as a consequence, I have experienced that one of the parts that organizations deal the least with are endings. So when things end. And so I was actually wondering, how do you think about endings in this practice, and what role do they have, and what space do they have in all the structures that you created, like between the podium and the temple, like how do they interact in this practice?
Really good question. I guess I was talking to my students a couple of weeks ago about those final presentations and going, okay, actually, if you're talking about a handover, your secret weapon is inspiration. And it's not a secret weapon, it's your only weapon. Actually, the only way you can get people to move is inspiration. So been doing a lot of work on looking at, okay, if you know what drives people, you also know what can inspire people. Let's say Roger is very much driven by a sense of justice. So that's his strength, and that's also his weak spot. If I want him to do something, I know I can just sort of push that button and he'll just move in that direction. So knowing what people's inspiration or motivation is really important. And my father actually used to be head of HR in a very big insurance company in the Netherlands. And he always used to say, yes, if you want people to move, you can put pressure on them if you first design the way out for them. You don't want the pushback, but you have to be meticulous about sort of before you apply the pressure, you have to sort of show where that pressure can lead. And then on the whole, people are well-meaning, people are nice, and even if people don't believe in it for a little while, they might be willing to give it a try, etc. So it's a kind of avoiding confrontation by knowing very well what drives people, what's important to them, and making sure that you take care of that in what you propose. I think and there's this list of 15 positive drivers, which are really fascinating, and you can more or less read, again, you hear what people are saying, but you also hear what drives them, why they are saying things, and those drivers are the important thing to take along, because you don't want to discourage people, or you don't want to push a different value than people have on them. You can't. You don't have the right to, and it actually doesn't work. So it's really about understanding that very deeply. Or if people, like the farmers, they're fighting back because they feel stuck, because they feel backed into a corner that they can't get out of. What we're doing is creating spaces where there are ways out, and they're looking for that. But if you can't create those spaces, then there's no way out for them. I mean, so let's say one of the projects we did within that nitrogen suite of programs was actually about something we called free fields, which was basically we got land from municipality and we gave that to farmers and nature people together as a team. Basically said, so this has to be productive in a farming sense, and it also has to be productive in a nature sense. You guys sort out what this is. We'll support you if you need knowledge that neither of you has, etc., etc. But try to create something there that does both, and we'll help you, but we'll monitor it because we're really interested in what you're doing, and you're going to have to be creative, and etc. And so that actually took off really well. Lots more people than we thought would be interested were interested in that, including some of the leaders of the farming protest. We're sort of going along, okay, let's try something here. And then I got a call from the ministry saying, well, we really enjoy the fact that your free fields projects are doing so well and that they're so productive. They're also illegal, because within Dutch planning law, something is either nature or farming. You can't have both. So they had to make a new category to legalize the things that we were already doing. So you see how a current way of thinking and working, it inevitably sort of deals with the rules that you're under, basically, because the rules are another way to formalize and fossilize, more or less, these kind of things. So getting the people that make the rules engaged in these projects so that they become part of, okay, these are new practices that are look to be valuable. How can we support those practices, or what problems do these practices bring? Also made the farmers feel a lot safer, the fact that they were involved rather than they would be confronted by new rules that didn't make any sense. So I think it is all of those kind of things together, and but definitely sort of this has to be inspiring, otherwise it's nothing. Basically, this has to take people along, otherwise we're asking a lot from people. We're asking people to change their mind. We're asking people to change their mastery. We're asking people to change what they see as good, being good in your profession. So we have to treat that very carefully and make sure that we know them well enough so that we can safely do that.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Donatella. Thank you. Joe, hello. Over to you.
Thank you so much for this. It's been from the beginning to the end. It's just like a block of inspiration and knowledge and frames that are going to be useful, I'm sure, for all of us here. Too many thoughts to put into questions. I trained as an architect, and I never thought when I trained that I would have to work with people so much. And then I started working with places and land and nature, and it got even more complex. So this has been very, very useful. I'd love to have an open question for you about the temple, because you only briefly touched on it, and I sort of feel like it's about how you sense the system, how you hold that frame and hold that place for people to be willing to enter the space of change, which for me is the most important first step of having them say, okay, I'll join, I'll play. I'll get out of the mindset of problem solving and causality and dance.
Yeah, and let's say that the temple is also where authenticity sits. So Roger and I, at some point, we were dealing with a care organization, a home care organization, and it was clear that, okay, people are interested in going into care, to work in care, because they want to care for other people. But these organizations get very big, they become very bureaucratic, and they get very transactional. You only have 1 minute and 20 seconds to do this and do that and do that, which means that the whole idea of care sort of more or less leaves the organization, while it's the motivation for people to be engaged, to be in care. So the problem they had, they came up to us with basically saying, well, we're losing more people than we can hire. We're growing as an organization, but we need publicity to get more people into our organization. And you think, well, actually, as an organization yourself, you're not caring at all for the people that you're employing. And the notion of care, if that's the central driver in everything, it should be everywhere. It should be in everything that you do. It should permeate everything that you do. An organization that, or a conversation that has care in it is different from a conversation that doesn't have care in it, etc. And I think that's what people often miss. So part of the temple is really understanding deeply the values that are at play and making them personal, understanding them personally, and using the, let's say, the clarity that you have about drivers, etc., and the clarity that you have about things that are at play, also to enrich how you're doing things yourself. So it is about taking it personally. And it's kind of interesting how one of the things that we're sort of sometimes butting up against is a notion of professionalism, where people see professionalism as something that, okay, I have to be not involved myself, I have to be distant, I have to be objective. So they create a distance between themselves as a wonderful person and the things that they're doing. And that becomes a very mechanical thing. What we're doing here is saying, bring your whole self. You're going to need everything. And you're going to be very good at understanding some themes, and other themes may be further away from what you've encountered in your life or what is important to you. You need other people to actually be involved in those, etc. So it is very much, in that sense, this kind of self-reflection and enriching, which you absolutely need to make sure that people can activate that authenticity. That it's not just, oh yeah, we've made up another vision for the organization and we've made up a new strategy and it's the same word salad that we had before but with different words, more or less. Then complain that it's not alive in the organization and see that as an implementation problem. You think, no, it's actually, if you don't live it, you can't show it. It all becomes very much a lie. And that's really nasty in an organization when people feel that they're almost lied to, which was more or less the care in that, and the case in that care organization. Then there's so much mistrust, and valid mistrust in a way. And so it's really important that if we say that something is important, it should be important in everything. These themes are the drivers in our sector, then they should be everywhere in that sector. You can't just say, well, it's for my staff, but I'm different. No, if you're sort of heading up a care organization, you're going to need to be caring. Otherwise, it is a lie. And I think that's often what people forget. So, but it's funny that sort of when I sort of present that studio model, people go lab, experiment, yeah, academy, learning, yeah, podium, oh, okay, yeah, I can sort of get that. And then temple is where people go, yeah, that's it, that we don't take enough time for, basically. or that's where we see innovation as something for the other rather than for yourself. Well, temple is also where the personal learning and personal growth happens. So just putting it on the agenda and helping people create a space for it and give it a little bit of a shape is important. And it actually is the kind of thing that keeps people in their job, basically. It's not a mechanical job. It's something where I learn. It's something where I grow. It's something where I can feel part of. So it is, you could almost say that if the temple is okay, the rest is also okay, more or less. But normally we don't even think about it because we're professionals and we're not supposed to change, really. We're supposed to sort of have knowledge and skills that we need to apply and just completely and put, sort of more or less leave your personality by the door because we don't need it. No, we do need it in this kind of stuff.
Thank you, Joe, for the question and the comments. Krithika, hello.
Hello, thank you so much for this session. This is my first time with House of Complexity. I've been a part of the Capra Book Club, and I'm presenting on farming systems next month. So it's actually very nice to hear you speak, because most of the times I'm talking about this divide that we have, and especially in India, and the level of complexes that exist, and the perceptions that the divide is between the researchers and the farmers, the industrialists and the farmers. So there's so much of divisions that we actually talk about. But there was one thing that I was actually curious to ask you about is when we talk about climate change, and we know we talk about uncertainty and risks, both come into the same sentence, but you put them two apart. So if you could explain it a little bit more.
So,
because we call it climate change, and then we call it climate risk, and then we say uncertain climate. Everything falls into the same sentence. So, yeah.
Yeah, so let's say, just pick it apart a little bit, just from the way, how do you react to uncertainty? By learning, basically, by probing, by trying things out. How do you deal with risk? You try to assess it, and you weigh and decide whether it's worth it or not to take that risk or not. So those are completely different movements. And the fact that these two things are conflated, often in people's minds, is really not helpful at all, basically. And when you're talking about the bigger issues, you go into a situation where you need to deal with that uncertainty, and that uncertainty is going to be your life, more or less. One of the things that the farmers in Holland demanded when they started protesting is, we want clarity from the government. Basically, we want the government to fix this. And you go, this is such a complex area. That clarity is never going to be there. We're always going to have to deal with uncertainty, but we have to deal with uncertainty together. And the government has to be good at understanding, being transparent about their own uncertainties and what they're going to be doing about it, etc., etc. It's going to be an evolving situation. And by the way, talking to some of the protest leaders in the farmers, going, you really want the government to decide for you what is good and what is not? No, you don't want that either. So when you're asking for clarity from the government, you're basically setting them up for failure, and you're going to sort of have your next round of protests ready, more or less. You really have to be in this together, and we need to develop this up together, because there's so many issues that are linked to farming, food, what do we want with the country. And it's the nitrogen crisis now. Then in a couple of years' time, where there's drought in the east of the country, there's salination of the soil in the west of the country. As groundwater levels drop, more seawater comes in. There's surface water quality. 2027, there's going to be new EU rules in place, and it actually means that you will have to have less cattle on your fields because they're not allowed to be so close to water, because they pollute the water too much, etc., etc. And you go, well, it would actually be an absolute waste to try and fix the nitrogen crisis now with one-off measures, knowing that what you're going to be needing is a system that can deal with all of these different things in succession, but also together. And actually, maybe the solution to one is also the solution to another, etc., etc. So it is about allowing that idea of, no, we're never going to be certain, never going to be for always. It's never going to be fixed. But as we are in there together, and if we're transparent and honest with one another, we can deal with this. We can find ways forward for this. But it's a complete mind shift from, okay, this is a crisis, so it needs to be not there, so it needs to be fixed. And we want the government to fix it for us. And well, A, as a farmer, you don't want the government to fix it for you. And B, you're part of that whole ecosystem which has caused the problem. The government is also part of that ecosystem where they've caused the problem. So it is about the quality of the conversations. The quality of the relationships is what's going to help you keep moving forward. And if you don't tend to that, but just go for one-off fixes or whatever, or very transactional relationships, it's just never going to work. It's never going to be leading to vitality in a sense. So I think it's a very, very big shift for people to take. But part of it is just realizing that this is the world we live in. These things are so connected that you can't, if normally, let's say a normal engineering way of working would be, you've got a very complicated area of problems, and you're going to sort of divide them into sub-problems, and then you're going to resolve those sub-problems that are doable, and then you build together the solutions. But in real complexity is what we're talking about here, is that, okay, everything is so connected that as soon as you start meddling with one little bit of the problem, everything else starts to move. So you can't look at that in isolation anymore. So that's not the right strategy. And bringing other things in also allows you to, you broaden the problem field with that. Basically, you broaden the issues, but you also broaden the possible solutions, and you broaden the different values that are at play in this space. So you're creating a different, more fluency in the field than looking at it, okay, this is farming and farming needs to solve this. Because no, that's not true. It's a societal problem. And we should be in there together. And farming is an important part of it. So I also had to sort of go back to the ministry and at some point say, well, you're treating this like you're the problem owner of this issue. But it's a societal issue. You're actually the problem holder. You're allowed to hold it for now, but it's not yours to solve alone. And you need the others, basically. So that's the big shift that we need to make around these very big issues. Because otherwise it's always going to be, very local and not very effective. And it doesn't really address the issues, the big issues that it should be addressing.
Thank you. Thank you, Kees.
Thank you, Krithika, for your question. And that really brings us to a close. So I really want to thank you, Kees. It's been a few weeks since we saw each other, which is unusual. So it's lovely to spend a bit of time with you tonight, and thank everyone for coming. Such a really engaging chat, and the questions that were asked really showed, I guess, that there's a lot of work to be done together, and we can only really do it together. Steve, would you like to make any comments?
Just a massive thank you, Kees, and everyone for joining us. Very rich conversation, and looking forward to more to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Wonderful. Well, stay tuned for the next episode of House of Complexity.